Welcome into the back room, David. Or should I say, uh, welcome into the back room, Jeff Spicoli, dude. Are
Uh,
you the 2025 Jeff Spicoli?
I would say of former Obama White House staff who are from the East Coast, maybe.
Uh-huh,
That's that's about my level of surfer dude these days, but I do my
uh-huh.
best.
So, congrats on the book. I loved it. It's called It's Only Drowning, a true story of learning to surf and the search for common ground. You wrote a book about surfing, but it's really not about surfing. And it's so smart and poignant. The writing is so crisp and accessible. It's laugh out loud funny. And it really has a wonderful, important, ultimate message. So tell us about the book and why you embarked on this incredible journey.
Well, thank you. Hearing you describe the book, I'm like, all right, I should
Yeah,
read
you're
it.
done. Right. I did your work for
Yeah,
you.
exactly. Um, well, as you say, this is a surfing book and also kind of not. It started as just a surfing book because during the pandemic, I think like a lot of us, I was stuck reading the news and worrying obsessively. And my wife would sometimes say, maybe you should get a hobby. And I would tell her I have a hobby, and my hobby is reading the news and worrying obsessively. Right? It was a dark time. And one of my ways eventually of getting out of it, finally, I took her advice and I signed up for surf lessons. And I thought when I got hooked on surfing, I was like, okay, maybe there's a book here just about whether I can learn to surf because I started at age 35, which is the rough equivalent of learning guitar on your deathbed, right? Like
Right.
it's not recommended. And ultimately, what really stood out to me was yes, this is a surfing journey, and I'm really happy that I got to make that, the through line of the book. But the person who I spent the most time with during this journey was my brother-in-law, Matt, my wife's younger brother, and the two of us have literally nothing in common. And so, in a weird way, what started off as this kind of like man versus nature surf book became almost like a rom-com, except instead of about like, can Harry and Sally get together? It was like, can these two guys with nothing in common become friends?
And you're sort of downplaying the nothing in common thing. Like he's on a very different political spectrum from you. I mean, socioeconomically, culturally, spiritually, you guys are really different people, which makes it such a deep, fascinating journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to me because you can almost pick a category, right? Food, sports, music, you name it, and I can tell you why Matt, my wife's younger brother, and I are polar opposites, right? So when it comes to music, right, he listens to death metal. I asked him the other day because I think I forget. I was doing some interview and they said, "What's Matt's favorite song?" So I asked Matt, "What's your favorite song?" And he said, "Soil the Stillborn." And I was like, "That's got to be a joke." And he was like, "No, it's really good." And I was like,
Isn't that the favorite song of all of us?
well, I listened to it because I was and I again, I was like, these are matters of taste. I'm not saying it's a good song or a bad song. I will tell you it's
Right,
not for me and it's totally
right.
for him.
Hmm.
In the same way that like I psych myself up by putting on like Sunday in the Park with George. And somehow I don't think that like Matt is gonna be like, all right, I'm gonna start lifting weights to Stephen Sondheim. But here we are. And I think a lot of these differences that I talk about in the book and also, just that are real in real life, they didn't mean as much until the pandemic. And then, as you said, there's a political dimension to this. This isn't a political book,
Hmm.
but during the pandemic, that to me was the first time where it felt like everything got political. And also it became like I tell you three or four things about someone, and you're like, oh, I mistakenly, it turns out, know everything about them, right? This is what they listen to. This is the car they drive. This is the job they have. Okay, here's who they voted for. Here's whether or not they got the COVID vaccine. Here's what news they watch. And I think that moment, um, this was a trend for a long time, but it became easier and easier for us to sort each other into teams, right? The way I put it in the book is it felt like we were drafted into opposite sides of the culture war. Like we didn't choose it, but it kind of happened to us. And in a way, the book is about not so much ending the culture war, because that's obviously still going on, but about saying, okay, we're dodging that draft, right? Like that's not for us. We're just gonna have fun surfing. And I don't know that that would be a kind of profound conclusion in most moments in American history, But I think in this one, it's actually pretty remarkable.
Yeah. You alluded to something a moment ago, which I also give you mad props for because you are very brutally honest in the book about mental health and issues regarding depression, which is a very important subject today. And I think it was really cool for you to, open up about that and how that impacts your life.
Well, thank you for saying that. I feel like for me, when you look at my resume, especially the beginning of my resume, right, starting at the White House when I was 24, et cetera, I was nervous in a way about talking about some really low moments because it kind of runs counter to that image of like, young guy who got, I would say got lucky, but also, had this sort of once in a lifetime opportunity early, all this different stuff. And that's exactly why I felt like it was important to do. During the pandemic, and especially kind of post pandemic, when it became clear that this was an era, not just a moment, I became really depressed for the first time in my life. I'd always been high anxiety, right? I'd been one of those people that's like high functioning, also high anxiety. When I was at the White House, I had to buy a special mouth guard because I would chew through the ordinarily priced mouth guards in my sleep. So it's not like I was a stranger to being, kind of nervous or concerned, but I'd always been able to handle it. And during the pandemic, that was the first time I really became truly depressed. And surfing helped me get out of that state. But I wanted to talk about being in it in part because I thought it was an important component of the book, right? It's a sign of, I think, how far I traveled during the time I described, but also because I think it's important, for me, any good piece of art, books or anything else, it's about making people feel less alone. And
Hmm.
I've definitely talked to some people since the book came out who said, hey, I've been dealing with some of that same stuff. And I just want to say thank you for talking about it. So the chance to make people feel less alone, I feel like, at the very least, let's try to seize that.
Hmm. And so for you, surfing obviously was an incredibly unlikely endeavor, especially one that you would able to ultimately share with Matt. It really required a lot of trust, a lot of patience, and letting go, right?
Yeah, letting go, and it's the way you let go. That's, I think, something I learned about surfing. So I had a surf lesson very early on with somebody who I forget the pseudonym I gave him in the book. So I'm just going to call him Bob because that's definitely not his name. But I forget what I call him in the book. Bob was like 17 years old, right? This was the first time in my life, I'm 38 now, where I've had to put my life in the hands of people who are literally less than half my age, and it's disconcerting. And Bob in this case was a surf instructor who you fall off the board and he's like, you fell off the board, and I'm like, that's not advice, right? That's a description. A little bit more advice would be helpful. And this goes on for an hour where I feel like I'm learning nothing. I've got sweat dripping into my eyes. I'm exhausted. I'm worried about sharks, like you name it. And finally, at the very end, this teenager turns to me and he says, "You know what your problem is?" And I was like, "Oh God." And he goes, "You know what your problem is? You are thinking too much about whether you're going to make the wave. And so instead, you don't end up going for it. I would rather see you go for it and totally wipe out than spend so much time thinking, am I going to get it? Am I not going to get it? That you don't even bother trying." And it is really disconcerting to have
Mm.
your whole personality diagnosed by a teenager in the water.
Yeah, well,
But that's what happened.
those of us who are parents and have had teenagers, that's an hourly
Yeah,
experience.
that's it. It's an interesting point, right? Because I don't have kids, and I do think that is, we have cats, but they're not quite as insightful. And I can
Cat,
see the cats
but
behind me, and they're giving me a
but
look.
they
But
but they are very judgmental.
that's right. But so, for me, you talked about letting go, and I think that is one way of describing it. But the way that I kind of think about it as a surfer, and now also when I'm not in the water, is about this idea of full commitment without full knowledge, right? There are moments when you feel like, all right, I've done the work, I've prepared, I think I can do it. And now I'm just going to say, I'm going to round that up to, okay, this is going to work. And I'm just going to launch myself off the top of the wave. And if you think that you may or may not make it, you will never make it. If
Hmm.
you know you're going to make it, you still might not make it, but at least you have a chance. And that's the
Hmm.
thing I learned when it comes to surfing. And it's also totally changed how I think about the rest of my life.
Yeah, and so this relationship that blossomed between you and Matt, what do you think it most taught you about yourself that you didn't expect to learn? Not just politically, but just on a real deep personal level.
I think I'm a lot more courageous because of what I've learned from Matt. We were talking about this just a second ago, this idea of launching yourself off a wave. And that's really the thing that Matt is better at than any other surfer I've seen. And we've now been in the water in lots of different places, lots of different conditions. I've seen some extraordinary surfers. The thing that Matt can do on a board that I've never seen anyone do is just claw himself onto a wave.
Mm,
And that level of commitment, and it, it's funny because I thought that he was fearless. But one of the things I sort of learned through the course of the book is that that's not it. It's that he thinks a lot about it beforehand and then switches into this mode where he just gets it done. And I can't say that I do that as well as he does on or off a surfboard, but I've definitely learned from it. And I think that's something I feel really grateful to him for. And I think the other thing that I learned, I think there is just kind of a open-mindedness that you end up getting whether you want it or not when you spend time with someone who, at least on paper, and actually I would say in real life, is very different than you. And it's really easy these days to spend time with people who are just like you. And that's, I think all of us immediately jump to politically because that's this huge divide in our country right now. But I think the political divides are sometimes downstream of the others, right? We just tend to be around people who feel the same, who make similar choices to the ones that we make because it's comfortable. And we talk a lot about getting out of your comfort zone with activities, right? Like that was surfing for me, or trying something new. But we don't think as much about getting out of your comfort zone with other people in your life. And I think, that was a really valuable experience. And I think about it as like I have a book and a hobby, but I also have a friendship. And the other thing I will add to that is, as a straight guy in his 30s, making a new friend is possibly the only thing harder than surfing.
right. And do you think stories like this can actually change minds in a divided country? Or are we too far gone for empathy narratives to make a difference?
I mean, Andy, imagine if I was just like, "Nah, I don't think so."
Hmm.
Yeah,
Right.
no, no, I do think that they can, and I think the reason I always, by the way, I'm very careful about the extent to which stories can change the world, right? I don't think it's that people are gonna read this book and start singing Kumbaya. I think that would be a
Hmm.
very strange thing, probably not a good thing. But I do think that people, and even people who have read the book and sent me an email or whatever, I talk to people and they've said two things that makes me feel really gratified and say, oh, okay, good, I wrote this for a reason. And partly to make people laugh and enjoy a beach weekend, but partly for because I want to help people, and I want to share the things I've learned. And one thing I have heard from people, some former colleagues, is saying, it's easy right now to get so down about the state of the world that it's hard to be engaged in it. It's hard to try to do your part to make the world better. And one of the nicest things nice piece of feedback I've gotten is from people who said, I was kind of struggling with that, and this makes me excited about my work again, or excited about, maybe it's not my work, but all of us have this part-time job of trying to make the world a better place. So that's one thing that I think, and that's almost that sense of courage and commitment without knowing what's going to happen. And the other thing is, a lot of people I've talked to have said to me, I have a Matt in my life, right? A friend, a family member, where it feels like we don't talk as much because of politics. And this gives me a chance either to reestablish contact or just keep the door open for an unlikely friendship or family relationship to occur. I talked to one person who said, okay, well, this has kind of convinced me to invite, I forget the family member question, I think it was a cousin or something, to the family reunion. And before we weren't speaking, right? And that I think is really important. And I do think, it's not like we're wave a magic wand and heal the country, but I think that if we don't do that, then we're really doomed. And so that chance to kind of, again, like I keep using that phrase, keep the door open, right? To sort of open those doors up to being surprised by other people in your life. I think that makes people's lives better. And I also think ultimately makes the country and the world better.
It's so interesting. And from a personal standpoint, the book really resonated with me because, like many people, I also have a Matt in my life, and his name is actually Matt. He's my brother. and and so the entire time when I was reading this, like I just kept thinking about my brother and like, oh my God, the things he says to me about Trump and the world and Obama and Biden. And it's like, and we're not close and we don't talk about
Hmm.
politics and we really don't talk. And I kept thinking like, all right, is David inspiring me to reach out to my brother and just take him for coffee and try to have a conversation where we can find common ground and maybe hopefully have some convincing there of reality and logic and things that are important to me and important to him as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is everybody is different and every relationship is different. So I'm certainly not saying, Andy, here's what you have to do. We met 15 minutes ago. Let me tell you how to manage your life. Uh, so I think that there is a way of thinking about this that I think will make most people happy they did it, even though what happens next is going to be different for everybody. So I do think that what you were talking about of just spending time with people, I think that usually feels it feels good, right? It feels more complete to spend time with people in your life. And I think that's important no matter what it leads to. And I also think um, that, when you're saying have a conversation, I don't, my guess is that conversation should not be about anything that's even remotely quote
Hmm.
unquote political. And I think sometimes these days we feel almost pressure, right? It's like if you care a lot about the political situation or the news or whatever you want to call it, we feel this pressure of like if I'm staying silent about something important, is that complicity? And I
Hmm.
think that, there are versions of it where yes, it is. But it doesn't mean every conversation or even most conversations have to be about that. Because to me, what's important is starting with that place of mutual respect, right? Like for me and Matt was this, and I was surprised by this. We've ended up having a lot more conversations about some of the topics where we disagree, but it only came after spending a lot of time talking about other stuff. I
Hmm.
think because we both have this sense of, okay, we have respect for each other, right? It doesn't mean that Matt respects every one of my opinions, but that's okay because I have a lot of respect for him as a person and vice versa. And the same thing, I think, you said something about sort of reason and logic, and that's probably how I would see it also. And yet at the same time, I think there needs to be some sense of that curiosity or saying, what can I learn from you? And it doesn't have to be what I learned is that you're right about everything. But if we have that moment where we're saying, hey, here's what I'm learning, it makes people a lot more open to say, all right, maybe this could run in both directions. And it's really tough these days. And that's the other thing. I mean, I've talked to lots of people who have read the book and said, like, this makes me really excited or hopeful about a relationship in my life. I've also talked to people who said, no, thank you, and I can't
Right.
tell them they're wrong, right? It's
Hmm.
just we're in a world where you know all kinds of relationships are being fractured. But my hope is that exactly what you said, right? You reading the book and asking yourself questions and saying maybe this can be a last resort, right? Maybe bringing people or not having contact with people in my life can be the last thing the last straw rather than kind of a first step.
Hmm. What do you think we misunderstand most about the people we disagree with? And how do you think or hope the book, or how does the book aspire to correct that?
I think we oversimplify people. It's very, very easy to assume things about people when we don't spend time with them. And one of the things that I feel like this book is just a chronicle of me making assumptions, often about Matt, but sometimes about other people as well. And I think of myself as an open-minded person, but I think it's very easy to make assumptions about others these days. I think many of us do it, and I maybe was foolish enough to write a book about doing it, but I think it's a pretty common occurrence. And one of the things I learned is basically every time I make an assumption about someone's motivations or about what is happening inside, what it's like to be them, I've been wrong. And the only antidote to that is having a sense of open-mindedness and humility and saying, I don't know why people are the way they are. I don't know why people do what they do. Even if I doesn't mean I have to be morally relativistic. but I can't just assume I know what's going on in someone's head. And the other thing is to get to a point in a relationship between two people where you can ask in a spirit of genuine curiosity, or you may find out, just while going about your day. But I think that really changed things for me and Matt. But I also think it's that, you were asking what's the easiest mistake, and it's gotten so easy. And and it's not, this is not a condemnation of liberals or conservatives or Democrats or Republicans or you name it. We're all living in bubbles. I mean, there's scientific research to bear this out, but there's also just all of our lives, right? Even I didn't know this actually till after the book came out. Even within neighborhoods, we are now becoming more segregated by beliefs and politics. So my neighbors are more likely to agree with me than my neighbors would have been 5 or 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 50 years ago. And what that means is it's very easy for me to look, you know, a couple miles away at people I may not really feel like I ever have contact with and say, oh, I know exactly who they are when I don't know anything about them.
Yeah. Did writing the book in any way change your worldview, not just politically, but on an emotional level or spiritually or on any level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pausing because I'm like a little I'm like, well, my worldview changed. It seems so pretentious. And so sometimes like that's the danger of surfing. You start to do things that are like a little cringy but totally true, right? Like I talk in surf metaphors a lot now, and on one hand, it's totally too much, and my wife is like, please stop. And on the other hand, I'm like, but they're good metaphors. They're legitimately they apply. So I guess what I would say is the biggest way that my worldview changed is that I think that I am I would actually point to two things, and I think they're not just about how I handle myself on a surfboard, but on they're about the way I see the world. So one of them is um we talked about this a little bit, but this idea of commitment and not a commitment without full knowledge, right? I used to dealing with this uncertain and frightening world that we have. I used to say, okay, I'm going to try to just learn everything, right? And with the internet, you can learn a lot, and usually what you learn is depressing. And one of the things I have found is that sometimes you just have to go for it. I know that seems like or might seem trite, but it's so hard these days, I think for many of us. And that's one thing that I found, and I've become the person where like we've got a whole bunch of great white sharks in the water off New Jersey this summer. And sometimes I'll be down at the beach and someone's like, is that a fin? And I'm like, yeah, don't worry about it. Right. Like it'll be fine. I don't know. And I'm like,
Hmm.
who is that guy? Right. Like
Right.
that was never part of me.
Hmm.
And I'm really happy that I unlocked that part of myself, even if I'm still also somebody who's like, trying a lot of the time to figure stuff out. So that's one way my worldview changed. And the other thing I would say, and I think we've been circling around it as well, is I think that I have a broader view of people. Right. And it doesn't mean that I had a narrow view of people before necessarily, but I think there's a thing that happens in the ocean where you have all these different people in the lineup, right? In a lineup of surfers, and they're all chasing the same feeling, and you don't know anything else about them. And it is a reminder of the things we have in common, even if they're like deep, deep down, right? Is like no matter who you are, when you're in that lineup, you're looking for this same magical experience and almost, as you said, spiritual. And I think that's very interesting because it means there's something that transcends all of the fighting and bickering and division that, especially with social media, we get so much of every day.
Yeah, overcoming fear, whatever that fear is, be it fear of surfing, fear of sharks, fear of the unknown, it can truly be so liberating.
Yeah, I would even go one step further, and this is one of the things I learned surfing, is that fear isn't just something that you need to overcome or avoid. Fear is something you can embrace. And
Mm.
sometimes fear is actually one of the most powerful positive emotions that we have. Not all the time, but some of the time. So my second surf lesson ever, I'm in the water and I'm on my board, feeling exhausted and very sore. And I turned to my instructor, Katie, and I said, Katie, I've noticed this interesting phenomenon. Every so often, it feels like the wave is about to crash on top of me and, kill me. Anything I can do about that? And I thought that Katie would respond with concern or compassion. And instead, she says, oh, that's the flower of fear. And she explained that the flower of fear for surfers means that when you feel that sense of abject terror, that's your body actually telling you you're in the right spot. That if
Hmm.
you go for it in that moment, the wave will propel you forward. And I think about that a lot in the rest of my life because sometimes, right, something is going on, or the world is a scary place where we all have things we're afraid of in life. And sometimes I say to myself, oh, that's the flower of fear, right? The fear isn't a bad thing. It's not something I have to beat. It's actually something I need to run toward and embrace.
You know, every situation is different. Every person is different. But do you see your friendship with Matt in some way as a blueprint or an exception or something else entirely for how we move forward as a country?
I think that it is um blueprint might be too strong a word, but I'm not upset that you used it, right? Like,
Hmm.
I guess that's what I would say. I
Hmm.
think that what what this experience showed me is that if we put aside, right, if we dodge the culture war draft, I guess that's the way that I would put it, right? If we stop saying everything has to be one team or another team, and we can't communicate with each other across those lines, I think that would be a very serious threat to demagogues in this country. Because when we stop turning on each other and we start to say, hey, we might have deep disagreements, but those disagreements don't actually mean everything, then it becomes a lot harder to demonize one group or demonize another group. And it becomes a lot easier for us to focus on things that we all care about. And some of those things I do think are political, or at least in a democracy, we accomplish them through politics, right? Like, I think if you talk to me and Matt, we have lots of disagreements, but the basic idea that, like, both of us, I'm a writer, he's an electrician, we should both be able to work hard and have comfortable, you know, middle class or above lives, right? That's something that would unite us, but it's obscured by all of the, cultural differences sometimes. And so I
Hmm.
do think that, um, this book got an interesting amount of coverage on Fox News recently. And I think one of the reasons is because I think if you're in the business of division, then Matt and my friendship is actually threatening.
Mm,
And
of
I
course.
think that for most people, it's the opposite, right? For most people, it's like, oh, this is a fun story. But not everyone sees it that way because I think for a small group of people, and it really is a small group, there's a lot of power and money to be had in dividing us.
Oh, absolutely. It's a business. It's a cottage industry. Do you think your story is replicable? Can most people find connection across deep divides, or might there have been some special circumstances that made this work for you and Matt?
I think there were absolutely special circumstances, but what I guess I would say is that if you're listening to this and thinking about that question in your own life, you have your own set of special circumstances, right? We
Hmm.
all do. It doesn't mean that but again, this is not a kumbaya book by any means, and it doesn't mean that every friendship or family relationship that has been fractured can be repaired. That's just not how the world works. But one of the things I will say that made me really hopeful as I was writing the book. So my editor is his name is Max Meltzer. He's great, and he's about my age. And when we were first talking and saying, "Hey, do we want to work together on this?" He said, "I have a friend who kind of reminds me of Matt," and we stopped speaking over, during COVID, or at least stopped hanging out. I forget, maybe they were still speaking. But um, and he said later, as we worked on the book, over time, he kind of reconnected with his friend. And to me, right, this was before the book was out. So there was not a lot of people who knew what was in it. So the sample size was small, but it was this sense of, okay, if working on the book and helping me write the book can help someone in their lives and in their friendships, then I think reading the book and sort of thinking about that story in your own life, I think there's a lot of people who might see this as, not just hopeful in a broad sense, or not just a hopeful story in the sense that it's nice what happened to me, it's nice what happened with my brother-in-law, but like, hey, this could be in some small way my story too. At least that's what I hope as a writer.
Hmm. If Matt were writing his version of this story, and Matt, if you're out there listening, may I suggest the title "David Didn't Drown"? Um,
Well, I would
what
say he
what
he gave me the title of this book too. This
Uh-huh, yeah.
so
What do you think
yeah.
he'd say about you and the friendship?
I think it's a good question. I've talked to him a little bit about it since. And I think the biggest thing, that I have learned is, from my perspective, I learned that you can't tell what's going on in someone else's head. And I think the same was probably true for him. This is just what he's told me, where
Hmm.
I think that, for example, I talk about kind of giving him the cold shoulder at family events over the vaccine, right? And that's how I felt. And I don't think that he necessarily even saw that. Um, and so it's interesting. And this, one of the things, and I am embarrassed to admit it, but I think it's important to admit, is that I think that one of the things I have learned is that in many ways, Matt has more generosity of spirit than I do some of the time. And I think that's part of it, actually, that I think sometimes he was looking at me and finding a sort of, innocent explanation for my behavior, and I was looking at him and sometimes finding, the not most charitable explanation for his behavior. And I think that's, again, you were asking what I learned from him, and I think that's something else that I've really tried to learn. And it doesn't mean that our disagreements, there are moments when we disagree, and I'm like, well, I think the evidence strongly supports my view, right? That hasn't changed. But what has changed, I hope, for me is that I can say, yeah, maybe I can summon at least some of that generosity of spirit. So I don't know what the book would look like, but I do think that it is, yet another thing that I think I've really learned from Matt.
Hmm. You still surfing?
Yeah, we were out just a couple of, what was it? Sunday, I think. Yeah,
Oh, cool. That's great.
yeah, it was good. The waves aren't huge right now in New Jersey. It's summer, so we're waiting for the hurricanes to come in. They usually come in usually around like August, late August, um, sometimes September. So that's the other thing that I've become the kind of person where, like, I don't claim that I'm like super chill about anything, but I am like, I hope we get some good hurricanes this year. I'm like,
I
what
know
again? Yeah, where did this guy come from? So,
that is a fun
that's
part
kind
of
of
the
when,
book,
yeah.
the struggle
Well,
that you have with, you know, the compassion and concern for people down south who deal with hurricanes, yet the unintended benefit to surfers up north.
yeah, that is an interesting thing I did not know about surfing, is that waves often start in tragedy, right? You get a big hurricane. You hope that the hurricane misses everybody and just kind of parks itself off the coast. But sometimes you get a hurricane that will devastate one part of the country and then move itself off coast, and then it becomes really good for surfers somewhere else. And it is there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in that sense in surfing, where it becomes this question of, like, can you enjoy something that from so many other people was so devastating? And I think in that sense, it is, a kind of a broader metaphor for what so many of us are living through in general today. If you're lucky enough to have a life that you feel really great about, you're still, if you read the news, you're looking around and saying, hey, yeah, I'm very lucky, and there's a lot of people who are really struggling in this moment. And I think one of the things that I learned is it's important to be engaged with the world, and also it's important to enjoy those moments of transcendence when they come. And you can do both, right? Having fun in a world that is full of tragedy, it doesn't make you complicit, it makes you complete. And that was something that I think I didn't fully understand when I started my surfing, journey. I hate the phrase my surfing journey, but that's kind of what we're talking about, right? And it is something that I feel like I have a better sense of now. And the more I can live like that, it's not just the happier I am, but the more capable I am of trying to make the world a little bit better.
Well, that's a really interesting point, which really does resonate with me on a deeply personal level. As my listeners know, I've been through some pretty horrific tragedy, and my attitude has always been that there's got to be some silver lining that comes from
Mhm.
horror, from tragedy. And I think those of us who do experience that kind of thing on some level, hopefully, we're fortunate enough to be able to muster up the strength and the determination and the ambition to find that silver lining.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, these things are that's the other thing that I think is important with all of this is whether we're talking, and as you just did, about dealing with tragedy in your own life, about figuring out your place in a very frightening world, all of these things, they're very difficult. And so I think the other thing is to give yourself some grace when you struggle with it or fall short or say, this was
Yeah.
not my best day, right? Actually, one of the things I learned from another teenager who taught me to surf, he said, and he kind of looked me in the eye like he was the old and wise one. And he goes, when I started out, when he was like 10, right? He
My
was like,
whole life.
yeah, exactly. He was like, I've been surfing half my life, 5 years. But he was like, when I started out, it was really frustrating. I would wipe out on 4 out of every 5 waves. And I just had to tell myself after every wipeout, you're a better surfer than you were before you started. And I that switch did a
Huh.
lot for me. And again, not just in the water, where on a day when I was writing the book and I was like, oh man, I wrote nothing but garbage today. To be able to say that means I'm a better writer than I was before I started the day, right?
Mhm.
You want to show up for a friend or family member, but you fall a little short. I think it's okay to be self-critical, but also to say trying made me better. And it
Mhm.
makes that makes trying easier. And I also, this is the thing that I keep coming back to that I don't think I fully internalized before I started surfing, is being someone who tries is just a much more interesting and fun way to live your life, regardless of the outcome. And so that's the other, it's like almost selfishly, right? Just try, because trying is it's such a better way to spend your limited time on earth.
Well, it also creates great stories. Like, hey,
Yeah.
remember that time I ended up in the hospital and almost died because I tried to climb Mount Everest? Like, it's a
Yes.
story, right? We need
Yes. Well,
stories.
I mean, I read every mountaineering disaster book, and so I will. So then there's also the people who are like, they tried and it didn't go quite so well. But I do think that but I think that's it. The other thing
Well,
is you don't know where.
the key is to be able to live to tell your story.
Yes, that I think is right. I think, and that's part of, for me, right? I'm not a daredevil type, right? And at the same time, I did some things where I would be like, only a daredevil type would do that, right? I've been chucked off a wave the size of a shipping crate. Um, that wasn't something I ever thought was on my bingo card. And I think that part of what I have learned from those experiences, and it just goes back to something that you were talking about, is you also don't really know what's going to happen. And I think that's truer and truer in a way that surprises me as I get further and further from being a student, right? I do think that when you're in school, one thing leads to another thing. There's a sense of like, here's a track, I can be on the track. And so I have a general sense of what's supposed to happen next. It may happen, it may not. Life is uncertain, but at least there's a path and I can kind of mark myself against that path. And as I get to the point where, like, I'm still young actuarially, but I'm not like a young person, or I'm not a youth. I can see, and I see this with my friends as well, stuff is more random than you thought. And so just being somebody who tries means that interesting things happen to you even if you can't predict them. Actually, when I worked in the White House, Valerie Jarrett, who was the president's senior
Hmm.
advisor, she always used to say, put yourself in the path of lightning, right? Like, be someplace where things are happening so that things are happening to you, rather than a place where you're just trying to make everything happen and control everything on your own. And I think during kind of peak pandemic, when we were all locked up, when I was, or locked down, and when I was, like doom scrolling on the internet constantly, that was as far from the path of lightning as you can get. And
Right.
both surfing and writing have kind of, I feel like, put me back in a place where, I don't know what the rest of my life is going to look like, but I'm excited to see what happens, even in a moment which is, frankly, a pretty terrifying time to be a human in the world.
Yeah, well, it's a good segue into what I'd like to talk with you about in our remaining time. Since we've safely concluded that you're not a professional surfer, let's talk about
Sadly.
let's talk about the space you've typically traveled in vocationally, and that is politics. You worked for former President Barack Obama. Yesterday, the sitting U.S. President, Donald Trump, said a former president, your former boss, Obama, is guilty of treason, an offense that can carry the penalty of death. It seems every day is a Rubicon crossing with Trump, but we have truly entered uncharted territory here, haven't we?
Well, as you say, right, we've been living in uncharted territory for such a long time. And I want to be careful because I don't speak for President Obama or anything like that. So I'm just going to say this as a couple of things as a civilian. So number one, I think, you know, it's so much has happened, right? Every day is 1,000 years these days, that we forget that Donald Trump politically came to power or came to prominence by falsely claiming that Obama was born in Kenya. So this is,
Right.
in a way, he's going back to, it's like when you see, it's like the play Freebird of Trump,
Right.
right? Like Trump conspiracies, right? He's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
things are going bad. I better pull out something totally wild and obviously untrue about Barack Obama. And then the question becomes, why is he doing that? And I think the answer is pretty obvious, which is all the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. And I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, what's in the Epstein files or whatever, but you have this moment where Trump didn't just make a promise, he sided himself very clearly with populists in a populist moment, right? Release the Epstein files
Mm-hmm.
was a shorthand for there is a group, a shadowy group of powerful people, and they're controlling everything and getting away with everything. And we need a fighter who will take them down. And now instead of taking them down, Trump is like, oh, by the way, I'm in those files, so don't release them. Right? It would be ridiculous if it wasn't so terrifying. And so what he's basically doing is saying, actually, I'm a globalist, and all you populists were idiots for believing in me. And you can see why he's desperate for a distraction. So I
Mm-hmm.
think this, um, to go back to surfing for a second, one of the things I found in surfing is you have to be able to internalize two truths at the same time, right? So when surfing, that's often like you feel like you look really cool, and then you see a picture of yourself, and you're like, I have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Right.
That, by the
So
way, that's every time I look in the mirror.
yeah, right. But both of those things are true, right? The moment when you're like feeling yourself and you're like, "Oh, I look great," and then you see someone took a picture of you and you're like, "Oh my God, I have to get a haircut badly or whatever. I have to hit the gym." Right? Those things, they're both true. And to bring this back to the much more serious thing you're talking about, I think things can simultaneously be absolutely laughably ridiculous and extraordinarily dangerous. And I think we're living through that a lot in the second Trump presidency. And the one thing that I will say politically that gives me hope about all of this is Americans, by and large, are seeing through it. I'm not saying that everybody who voted for Trump says, oh, this is all nonsense. That's obviously not true. But if you look at Trump's approval rating, the more Mad King he gets, the less people like him. And that doesn't mean everything, especially in a democracy that is threatened like ours is right now, but it definitely means something, right? If you look at autocrats in other countries that have taken power through democratic means, often, Viktor Orban in Hungary is a good example, swept into office with a wave of populism and then able to ride that wave long enough to make major changes to the constitution. And by the time people said, oh, this is corrupt and bad, it was too late. And one of the things that I admire about the American people in this moment, even though I disagree with the slim majority that voted for Trump, um, one of the things I admire about the American people in this moment is there's something in our DNA that says, "Hey, Mad Kings are not for us." Right? That's not
Mm-hmm.
we like the whole reason we exist is that we do not like Mad Kings. And I think again, I don't know what's going to happen. This has kind of been a theme of our conversation, but I do think that there is, with all of the stuff that is very frightening, a cause for hope, which for me is the more um, Rubicons Trump crosses, the more Americans say, "Hey, this is not what we want." And I think we're in a world where what the people want doesn't count for everything. It should count for more, but it still counts for something. And I am proud to see that Americans, we still have some of that revolutionary DNA.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I also agree that what he did yesterday, as well as all the other things he's done in the last week or so, is a desperate attempt at distraction away from Epstein. But the thing that caught my eye yesterday was that Obama, through his spokesperson, felt compelled to issue a very rare statement in response to this threat and to strongly refute Trump's patently false claims. Knowing him as you do, I mean, you literally wrote words that came out of his mouth eventually. What does this say to you? What should it say to us that he got off the sidelines this way and felt the need to address this? at this time?
Well, I think what I would almost focus on or think is more notable here, because people like to draw this false equivalence. People say, "Oh, well, Trump is a maniac, but all politicians are maniacs." Um, to me, the thing it really underscores was how respectful President Obama has been of the office of the president,
Hmm.
even when the occupant of that office isn't just trying a all right, is trying to undo President Obama's legacy and policies, which much more than the effect they'll have on President Obama, right? They're going to hurt lots and lots of Americans. Or Barack Obama's going to be fine, but if you're on Medicaid and this bill just passed, you have every reason to be really scared about what's going to happen to your healthcare. So that's one area where Trump is trying to undermine him. But the other thing is, this is somebody who, and Michelle Obama talked about this at the Democratic convention last year, right? This is someone who became a leading political figure based on conspiracy theories about Barack Obama. And despite that, out of respect for the office of the president, he has weighed, carefully when he's going to say things. And I thought, if you look at the statement that they put out, and I obviously had no knowledge of it or anything like that, so I'm an observer. But as you say, I'm used to work in the White House. I thought it was notably short. Right, basically what they're saying is this is ridiculous. And I think the other thing, I believe they pointed out that it's a distraction. And I think that, again, it's a scary time. What is currently giving me hope at a moment when there are also a lot of things giving me some serious concern is that it's being covered, not on Fox News, but everywhere else, as a distraction, right? I mean, if you look at the New York Times, which is, I think, bent over backwards to be fair, sometimes too fair, to Donald Trump, they're saying, with the Epstein files in the news, Trump attacks Obama. And I think that's an important, if the 60% of the country is looking at this and saying, come on, this is obvious, right? I mean, I said this on TV the other day, but it was like looking at the guy at the Coldplay concert, right? Like, you're like, that is not the behavior of an innocent dude. And so I think that is an important thing to remain, sort of keep front and center, right? Like, yes, this is outrageous, but the motivation here should be part of the outrageousness, and it should be in that story, because it wouldn't, these two things wouldn't be happening separately.
Yeah. It is strange times, and it's hard for us, a lot of us, to trying to figure out how to navigate through it, because it is so
Yeah.
unprecedented.
I also think people forget that Barack Obama right now is the most popular political figure in the country by far, right? Like,
Mm.
Trump's approvals are around 40 something percent now, 44%. Obama's been around 59%. That means there's a lot of people who, I think there's a different, let me put it this way. Trump has chutzpah, but that's not the same as smarts all the time. Sometimes it looks the same. And I'm not sure picking this fight is going to be all that smart for him. But the other piece of it is, and I think this kind of goes back to some of the stuff we were saying before, the fact that Barack Obama is, close to 60% of the country is a fan. The fact that substantially more than that is a fan of his wife, right, Michelle Obama, who he would be the first to say is the most popular Obama. Um, it is, again, a sign that despite all of these divisions, we have a sense of respect for decency, for people who try to do the right thing, for people who behave in ways that are, we would want our kids to behave in. It doesn't mean everything, but it means something. And I think that, to try to bring these things back together, one of the things that I hope is that if that's what's happening on the national level, I hope that it can also happen on the person to person level. And I think, if it does, I remain, despite all the reasons that, that the odds are long, really hopeful about where we could go as a country.
Well, it is interesting, because I think it's what you said before, what you've been saying about where most of this country is, and what most people, regardless, even if they voted for Trump, what they feel ultimately they did not vote for. I can't
Yes.
imagine that a lot of people feel that they did vote to have the former president executed for treason. And as a lot of people believe, all of it in Trump's mind stems from the fact that he felt humiliated and mocked at a White House Correspondents Dinner with jokes. But by the way, you may have written,
I didn't actually.
Okay,
yeah, I
good.
just started at the time. No, I did.
But
It's kind of credit for them if I'd written them, but I didn't.
It's kind of crazy to think that, like, this personal vendetta he has over nothing, over nonsense, doesn't stop him from making claims that could lead to the execution of a former president. That I refuse to believe my fellow Americans want to hear or won't reject summarily.
I think that's right. I hope we don't get to the point where we have to find out, but I think that the American people are more. It's a big country, but the majority of Americans are a lot more decent at heart than our current president by a pretty wide margin.
Mm-hmm. David, again, congratulations on the book. It's called It's Only Drowning. Folks, go buy this book. It's a perfect book for the beach this summer. It's got everything. It's got sharks. You'll love it.
It does have some sharks. It's true. All right.
Good
Thank
luck
you,
with
Andy.
it. All right.
Yeah, I
Take
appreciate
care.
that.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.